Let me turn it open to our participants in the audience. Does anyone have opening questions? See the gentleman at the top.
Marek Matraszek, CEC Government Relations. I'd like to sort of focus on the theme of shale. And I think I agree with some of the sentiments of the panel that shale is potentially a huge game changer in Europe, both politically and commercially. But what we're seeing is at the same time this opportunity is before us, there is a growing coalition of interests across Europe which are trying to slow the process of the development of shale down. I mean, there are three pillars of this resistance. One is political. We've seen this in France, especially with the recent vote in the French Parliament. There is the NGO lobby, which is the Greens. Essentially, we're seeing them becoming much more active publicly, criticizing shale from an environmental perspective. And there is also the commercial resistance, which is coming from Gazprom in Russia, which obviously sees shale as a potential challenge to its whole business model of gas exports into Europe. So there's a coalition of interest developing, which is potentially going to stunt the development of the shale industry in Europe, and especially in Poland at the European level. So the question to the panel is really, what should governments, commercial operations be doing to work more closely together to counter this threat? And is it possible, in fact, to sort of coordinate both government and industry in that area? So that's one broad question about shale, but I just have one more supplementary question to you, so if you could perhaps draw any parallels between Norway and Poland. Both Norway, obviously, over the last 30 years, revolutionized its energy base through the discovery of North Sea gas. Are there any lessons that Poland can learn in terms of that, how a country which was hitherto resource poor can translate an energy discovery to its political advantage in Europe? So two broad questions there.
Trygve, if you want to start with that.
Let's take your first question first regarding the environmental aspects of shale gas. And there are some real environmental concerns. I think we have to bear in mind that the fundamentals of this technology, it bears on horizontal drilling technique and fracturing of under high pressure, with high pressure water plus additives of the formations which previously was more or less impermeable for gas. Now, this hydrofracking technique was really pioneered by a number of outsiders, by small oil and gas companies in the United States. The big oil companies did not really believe in this. So I think during these formative years, which really is, let's say, the last 10 years, a number of mistakes were made. Now the majors are moving in, they are buying up a lot of acreage, and they are buying the small companies, and I am fairly certain that they are quite intent on moving towards a best practice system, which would solve many of the environmental questions that are being discussed and have been discussed for a long time in the United States. So that would be helpful also in the case of Poland and European shale gas. And as far as I know, it is mainly large American-based oil companies like Exxon, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, who are at present engaged in development of shale gas in Poland. So I think that will be very helpful in reducing the real problems, the real environmental problems of shale gas. Then I think there is also the case which was mentioned here about the energy policy in the European Union, because although it is clearly stated that it is for each member state to decide the composition of its own energy mix and how they dispose of their own energy resources, it is also very clear that both the 2020 policy and the roadmap or the agreement that has been made to reduce by 2050 CO2 or climate gas emissions by 80 to 95%, that will in itself put severe limitation on each member's ability to actually choose whether it is their energy mix or the modalities of their energy resource development. So this is an important issue for anybody wishing to produce oil and gas inside the European Union. The Norwegian case, I think there are some lessons that can be learned in the case of Poland, and I think yesterday there was a meeting between the Prime Minister of Norway and of Poland to discuss energy cooperation and how, what should let's say the state do to make sure that they get the best possible deal out of this. I think if you wish to characterize Norwegian oil and gas success seen from the Norwegian state's point of view, I think it is that we have been able to, through a combination of taxation system and concession system, to make sure that the international oil industry employs the best technology, works and deliver, say, top quality products with a minimum payment to the companies and a maximum return to the state in terms of taxation. And that is not a bad recipe for Poland either in the case of shale gas, in my view.
Tricky, just briefly, is it premature for Poland to start thinking about creating a reserve fund off of earnings from gas? Something that Norway has done and others have done.
I think that is way too early. In Norway's case, we didn't really start to make any major entries into that reserve fund until 10 years ago. And that was after 25 years of oil and gas exploration and production.
Yaroslav?
Just one word on environmental concerns, because they are first valid, and also in Europe they play much more greater role than in many other parts of the world. It is a real problem, but one has to look at the environmental concerns not in separation. One has to look what we want to achieve in area of environment in its totality. And when you look for other energy sources, in Poland, shale gas will be competing, to put it this way, with coal. So you have to look what are the environmental effects of other fossil fuels, and to which extent these problems are managed better or worse in each situation. And obviously, when you make a comparative analysis, it appears that you have to look for all those sources which are less polluting. Secondly, Europe already has got a quite strong and restrictive environmental legislation. It is, as John Lehman has said yesterday in the panel, in the US, there was a regulatory framework came well after technology came. I think that in Poland, we already, and in Europe, we already have a relatively advanced environmental legislation. So in a certain way, you are in the middle way of this regulatory framework that could exist. But obviously, there is a challenge to which extent things are being picked up, singled out, and then used not a bit out of proportions. Because I think there will be a proportionate reaction, and there should be a proportionate reaction to dangers that can be linked to shale gas production. But the question is whether this will be proportional or whether it will be excessive. But taking into account the goals that we have until 2050, I think that gas in general and shale gas in particular situation can be kind of a bridging mechanism linking development of renewable energy to limit gas CO2 and other emission of gas that would affect the climate. When you look at the recent decision of Germany on nuclear power, it is related to rapid development of renewable energy production. So rapid that one could wonder what will be the price of it, because it needs a really substitution of the energy from nuclear powers. And also how much it would cost and what would be the final outcome. And the one would say maybe for attainment of CO2 emission targets, it would be a bit easier to, in a meantime, between now and 2050, to have a period where we use intensively gas, including produced from our own shale gas resources.
Johan, in light of this, is nuclear power jeopardized by shale gas or renewables?
I think when it comes to well-developed energy markets or electricity supply markets, they are typically have a number of generation sources, and gas is one, and nuclear is another complement that provides some other qualities. I mean, not the least the diversification, both from a technology perspective, but also from a geopolitical energy security supply perspective. But then underlying everything, there is still a growth demand, both from a overall economic growth demand, but also from a large need for replacement. If you look at the generation fleet across Europe, there is a huge demand for replacing both gas, coal, and nuclear power plants. So with that type of demand, I think there's plenty of room for all kinds of generation sources. There may be some shifting in proportions of various supply sources depending on the region and conditions and possibilities for exploration of new energy sources, be them renewables or gas or nuclear. But many countries have been successfully also used nuclear as a complement to accomplish just that diversification from various fossil energy sources.
Adam, let me go back to you as from a consumer point of view. When your industry is sitting and looking at some of the changes that are going across Europe and its energy policies and infrastructure, as an industry, when you look up to Brussels and you look at plans like 2020, and you look at plans to kind of further integrate Central Europe's infrastructure into the West Europe energy market, are your industry satisfied with progress being made and directions being made? Do you tangibly see benefits coming down the pike from these initiatives?
It's a difficult question because we must remember that in Poland, more than 90% of energy is from coal sources. And we can't replace these sources in a few years. It's a very, very long, I think, few decades, plans to replace these sources on renewable. Second point is that this source is very old, more than 40 years old. And EU CO2 policy, I think, will force in Poland to build a nuclear power plant. If I see that in Germany they turn off a nuclear power plant, I think I'm not police, I'm businessman. What now? We start to build energy from France from nuclear power plant. I know in future we will change these plans for renewable sources, but they have a coal power plant too. We must remember that energy from renewable sources is very expensive. And in Poland, the position in business plan, price of energy, I think in most of industry company, it is a second cost in production, cost of energy. It's very difficult in Poland.
Back to the audience, sir.
Thank you, Ian. It was mentioned from the very beginning, energy in relation with foreign policy and the decision-making process, which is so complex. We have seen the effects of Fukushima in the domestic politics in Germany, and now like a domino around Europe. So I wonder why we are not using the experience used by Branson with a carbon war room. Why we are not using energy security war room to have a better documentation for the decision we are taking in the field of energy, which are so complex? It's the first question. And the second, I wonder why we are not more discussing about the nexus between energy security, water security, and food security, because they are so much related. We mentioned yesterday that shale gas, wonderful perspective, but with which costs? Thank you very much.
Yaroslav, is there a carbon war room in the EU?
I think that the motivation for climate policy of the EU are based on a different motives, on different grounds than energy, security, and they are much more linked to environment and to global situation. It's also kind of a positioning maybe of Europe towards other parts of the world in technological race and so on. But it's much less on energy security. It is incidentally added, and it reinforces arguments. It also shows that renewable energy, even if it's true that the cost of renewable energy are quite high, then you have to think about all the costs involved. And once price of carbon will be clear and the carbon market will be established, it may appear that the energy from coal production will be much less competitive than it is now, simply because the price of carbon will be included. So it's a question how you look at it. But I think the one problem which is here mentioned relates to interlinkages between various elements, like water, like food, like energy. And you could also add some others as well. The question is that energy is much more clear and much more visible, whereas in Europe, water and food are not so much problem. It's greater problem for other parts of the world. But in a global analysis, we have to also take into account these two elements as well.
Thank you. Sir?
Rafał Rućko, National Security Studies, Wroclaw University. At first, in Europe, we have two very strong companies, energetic companies. From one side in France, Électricité de France, which is based on nuclear energetic, and from the second, Gazprom from Russia, which is based on oil and gas trading. According to President Wirt's speech, we have to make in Poland some alternatives to coal energetic. And we, for example, built a first nuclear plant, a Polish energetic group with Électricité de France. And my question is there a risk that the Électricité de France or Gazprom will have a strong influence to create energetic policy in Europe? Thank you.
Well, I think there is, Électricité de France, of course, has a very strong position already due to their long-term investments in nuclear. And I guess you could also argue that if the EU carbon policy, the carbon prices under the quota trading system, if that really involves carbon prices that become so high that it becomes more or less impossible to use fossil fuels in European electricity production, that would, of course, create a market opportunity for EU's neighbors, whether they are in Belarus, in Ukraine, or in Russia, or to the south. And one of the problems, of course, of the phase-out of nuclear in Germany is also the need to build a very extensive network of connectors, connecting, let's say, wind power in the north to cities in the south. So, yes, there is a possibility for neighbors, including Russia, and particularly with Russians' gas position, it might be tempting to seek alternative exports like electricity.
Andrew?
Indra Mikta, GMF Warsaw office. Coming back to shale, I'd like to raise one question. A lot of the conversation I've heard in Poland is largely about the volume, the yields, the potential, the transformative aspect of this. And yet it's striking when you look at the grid, the pipeline grid across the region, it is still largely the old, east-west kind of a pipeline grid. Even if you look at Nord Stream, it's still the Druzhba, running from the east, delivering to the west. Would the panel comment on what are the prospects on actually changing that and building a net of interconnectors, pipelines that can actually have redundancies in the system, increase security this way, in the event there is shortage, improved price negotiation position of those countries? I believe the data that was leaked from the German negotiations with the Russians was showing quite a spread, where the Poles were paying $330-some for 1,000 cubic meters of conventional gas. The Brits were paying $190, the French were paying $300. So that spread probably to some extent owed also to the inability to price competitively in the marketplace. So I'd be very interested in the comment on what are the prospects for building a more elaborate, integrated European energy grid when it comes to delivering natural gas. Who would build this, where the funds would come from, and what the long-term implications would be? Thank you.
Seems like a natural question for Yaroslav, since that actually seems to be a primary goal of the EU, and certainly is a big theme of the upcoming Polish presidency in the EU.
Obviously, there are two aspects of it. First is technical capacity, whether we've got enough interconnectors in every field of energy, including electric energy, including gas pipelines or oil. And the question, for example, for gas is whether gas can be pumped both ways or not only one way. And that is something which requires investment. When you look at flagship initiatives for Europe for years to come, 2020, there are some EU money related to interconnectors and to development of this type of capacity of diversification of gas and not only electricity supplies in Europe. But I would say it's only one part because it relates to technical capacity. What is more important is the gas market liberalization. If you refer to spreads of the gas price, one has to look at when contracts have been signed, on which conditions, for how long this gas supplied. And very often these are long-term contracts signed in different moments, in a different context of different prices. And therefore, one could say, logically, because they are different in nature, the contracts are different in nature, the spread of the between prices delivered to different regions in Europe is to a certain extent explainable. Yeah? It's not maybe justified, but it could be explained. The problem is that in many cases, these contracts, there is no possibility of selling this further. So if it is being delivered to one country, to one recipient, it cannot be sold by this recipient to someone else, resold. And that makes a problem of gas market liberalization in Europe. And I think before we've got really full liberalization of the gas market, it will be even still difficult to use technical capacity, even if it exists, of interconnecting various countries in Europe. So it has to go together.
I think in addition, if there is a real supply crisis, then it would be fully possible for the European Union members to agree to set up a crisis management group. There is already some kind of industrial coordination group for gas, similar to the one that has been used in the IEA since the oil crisis in 1979, where you basically agree that to pool all resources in the event that oil supply falls below a certain limit. I think the limit is 10 or 12% or something. And then also representatives of the oil companies will actually get together and make sure that available oil supplies of crude and oil products are allocated to the members. And I think a system like that is clearly also needed in the case of a European gas supply crisis. And such a crisis management, I think, would not be impossible to do, even if there are still some destination clauses in gas contracts. I thought, by the way, that they were all removed by now. But I think this is really a matter of having a vehicle whereby you can use solidarity principle in practice.
Let me follow on Andrew's question, because we've talked about, we're taking a kind of perspective looking at what the EU is doing to foster Central Europe's integration into the broader European market. But I'd be interested in kind of asking our panelists, maybe starting with Adam, kind of looking consumer up, but how do you assess the degree of coordination among Northern Central Europe, and Baltic and Black Sea in developing a kind of a coordinated approach towards the EU? I mean, sometimes I get this impression that there's competition between different nuclear power plants, Lithuania, Poland, Russia, competition over LNG terminals. I mean, I think now every country wants an LNG terminal. And so I sometimes get the impression there really isn't a coordinated approach from within the region. Adam, from your point of view, I mean, is that a source of frustration for industry?
For my firm, KGHM, as I said, it is a very difficult problem. What can I say in this moment? We have a big strategy in efficiency project in our firm. It's a very millions zloty every year. But it is a very modern firm, and we will build a new mining, new steel company. On this year, our consumption is about 2.5 terawatt hours per year, and about 2 years it will be about 3 terawatt hours. And I think the EU politics, climate, CO2 limited, is a very, very difficult problem for our firm. And not only for our firm in Poland, for industry.
Johan, how about from the nuclear power industry's perspective?
And maybe looking, sorry, maybe looking a little bit broader. When it comes to energy coordination, or it's one of the questions is clearly energy security of supply. That if you compare that to many nations in Europe, their views on security policy, of course there's a lot of willingness and interest in having coordination across Europe, but on the other hand, most countries are still a little bit hesitant of totally giving up their national policies, and this is applicable also a little bit on the energy side. There are other forces that do drive pan-European coordination, and one example are some of the large utilities. EDF has been mentioned, but most European utilities today are pan-European international, and they as much as the European Union, they need rules and guidelines that applies across country borders. So they are one vehicle in improving coordination. And there is, even though of course not as visible, but there is a lot of interlinkage, interconnections and grid connections that are being built that also are doing some of this. Well, is there competition between utilities? Well, it's hopefully energy, like many other businesses, is something that's economically viable to do, to work with. Therefore, many countries want to make those investments. So the competition is more in a matter of being first.
Trygve, from Norway, what's your view in terms of like pipeline coordination within Central Europe, oil and gas policy coordination in Central Europe? Is this a coordinated approach that's coming from the region, or a herd of cats each pursuing their own agenda and national interest?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, because traditionally, of course, this has been based on long-term contracts with, let's say, large, powerful European gas companies and suppliers in Norway, in Russia, Algeria, and so on. the new situation is really, in addition to the possibility of a European shale gas revolution, is really the situation in the LNG market, which has triggered, as you say, a number of investments in LNG terminals across Europe, and which, in my view, greatly enhances security of supply to the European Union in natural gas. Not only because there are a number of new supply possibilities opening up, but also because the amount of LNG that at any time will be in transit or in storage in Europe. So when it comes to, I think one of the problems of creating a truly integrated European network where gas can flow both ways is that it does not really, this would be a sort of crisis investment which does not lend itself easily to, let's say, private investments where you require a fairly high degree of, a high rate of return. So on a number of these cross connections, there really is a need for, let's say, public investments either by the member state or by union funds. Some of this is already happening, but I would argue that it is more difficult to create true cross-connection capacities in gas than it is in electricity, because there you can basically feed into an overall system. But there is a lot of work and money going into also strengthening the European coordination of electricity supplies, and in fact establishing also a common European regulator, both in gas and in electricity. It has been put off for a while, but it's working towards that.
Jaroslav, from your perch in the European Union?
Discussions on energy policy are extremely difficult in the European Union because interests of member states are quite diverse, because situation in every member state is a bit different. You know, when you look at Spain, or where there is plenty of renewable energy potential, France, where there is plenty of nuclear, Germany, where there is a different concerns of society, Poland having own coal resources. Everyone has got a different perspective, and therefore coordinated approach is much more difficult, because everyone has got a different elements in mind, and national governments have to take into account these sensitivities much more strongly. So it's more difficult to have a coordinated line. I think it anyhow progresses, and with time we are going towards much greater cooperation, and potentially if you know, Europe very often develops via crisis. I do not wish, but if there is a energy crisis in Europe, especially with gas, then you could have a reaction of member states willing much more than before to take common actions and coordination. But it's not, when it's not necessary, there is not enough incentive for member states to do something radical. And therefore, the situation stays a bit less coordinated than before.
Another point?
No, I wanted to react a bit, because the issue of decision-making process in the European Union is very complicated. And you cannot say that one company having huge interest, even huge company, can influence decisively the whole process. There are so many interests involved. So you cannot have one country dominating all 27, or one company imposing. I think what is more important in this context, what for the outcome, is what Adam said from KGHM, is a question of elements like, for example, in climate area, in CO2 emissions, which will impose cost for carbon for every energy source. The question is whether this will be also cost for imported energy. And this depends very much how the global situation would look like, whether there will be a global approach, whether negotiations will bring about changes to the taxing or putting a charge on carbon everywhere. Because otherwise you've got carbon leakage, you've got a different competitive situation. The same happens with the shale gas. If Europe is not developing shale gas, the question is what will happen in other areas, whether it will be developed in China, in India, in Australia, in some other places. Once it will be done, the Europe will be also looking differently because it will change competitive situation on European producers, not necessarily in areas which use plenty of energy, but generally in many areas. So I think that this global context is very important in discussing issue like shale gas or issue like climate, because Europe is not isolated.
Fran?
Take mine.
Fran Burwell from the Atlantic Council. I wanted to ask the panel to look forward maybe a decade or maybe even two, and to think about the prospects for Russian energy supplies. We hear a lot of times that the infrastructure is degrading and investment is not being put into Russian energy at the rate at which it should be. And we also hear, of course, that there is a great rival market, China, that is trying to get hold of more of that energy. Do you think that Russia over the long term is going to continue to be a supplier with all the difficulties and hiccups that may be for Europe, or is this something that Europe should not count on, say, after 2050 or something like that? Thank you.
That's a good question. For Trygve?
Well, I think the short answer to your question is yes. With the kind of resources that Russia has available in terms of gas reserves, pipeline infrastructure, and the investment that they are putting into this, whether it is in Yamal development and new pipelines or in the Nord Stream development, I think there's no doubt that Russia will be able to supply large volumes of gas to Europe. And in the case of the Nord Stream, which is basically well, one pipeline is already constructed, ready for operation. The next one is already being committed. And since it is a joint venture for the first time, not Gazprom owning the whole pipeline, but owning 50%, the rest being owned by their customers, essentially, Rogas, Wintershall, and so on, I am fairly certain that gas will flow in that pipeline as a sort of priority flow, because there is a common interest between the seller and the buyer to keep that pipeline filled and utilized as much as possible. The Nord Stream agreement also involved upstream investments, joint ventures in Russian gas fields for the European counterparts, particularly Wintershall and Rogas, as I remember it, which further, let's say, brings the gas companies upstream and integrates the system. So, and seen from a European security of supply point of view, I would argue that the more pipelines that connect the European Union to gas sources around the world, the better for security of supply. If in addition, like we have seen in the last couple of years, the LNG terminals are added, particularly in England, but also on the continent, then I think gas security of supply should no longer really be a great concern. And it has really only been a great concern since the crisis in Ukraine in 2006. That was a transit payment crisis. In my view, it was a pity. It was a chance for the European Union to call the bluff by more or less agreeing to guarantee Russia the transit payments for the Ukraine transit. But unfortunately, it ended up with a 3 weeks supply crisis for a large number of southern European countries. That triggered a strong debate, even making gas supply, gas security of supply, a sort of NATO issue. In my view, we have reached a sort of maximum level of politicization of gas deals now, and I think it is time also now for the commercial entities to start providing their solutions. Private investments in LNG terminals has already helped a great deal, and so is a private investments or Gazprom investments in new pipelines doing. In the case of the American shale gas revolution, that has not really been triggered by energy policy. It's been triggered by private initiative from, in the first instance, industry outsiders, now taken over by big companies. One of the most promising prospects, in my view, would be if there really would be great discoveries of shale gas in China, making Chinese self-sufficiency in gas, reducing their consumption of coal and reducing the pressure on the Middle East oil supplies. I think that would be a tremendous achievement for world security.
Okay. Unfortunately, we've already kind of passed the witching hour, and I think Trygve's points kind of end us off in a way that kind of captures some of the themes that I picked up from this discussion. Just quickly, I mean, first of all, his point about that when we think about energy security and infrastructure, we always have to remind ourselves it's important to build those plans with a commercial viability to it, because that will ultimately drive and sustain those programs. Two, I mean, the idea of slow growth in Europe has its downsides, but it also gives a little bit of breathing space in dealing with the challenges of energy security. And I think we got a kind of consensus here that basically Europe is moving in the right direction in terms of diversifying the kind of energy types that it uses, and it reinforces basically effort, and perhaps shale gas even serves as a driver to further kind of drive the infrastructure projects that will integrate Central Europe into the broader European market, and also facilitate a diversification of regional sources of energy. So with that, let me thank our panelists for joining us this morning.